Hello, and welcome back to the Offing Podcast. I'm Ashaki Jackson, publisher of The Offing and your podcast host. On today's episode, Dr. Dana Johnson, author of Elsewhere, California, and the Flannery O'Connor Award for Short Fiction winner, Break Any Woman Down, reads Wyatt Earp Days. A conversation between Dana and I follows her reading. Here is Wyatt Earp Days.
The days when white men and white men alone could find their fortunes in the West from mining green gold were over. It was time for other pioneers to seek their fortunes and build empires that would last generations. Those had been my cowboy thoughts, though I worried about how we would make our success happen. My brother and I had driven with casual ease out of California and through the desert, on our way to Tombstone, Arizona, and like the people, now ghosts, traveling west, we would almost lose our lives in the endeavor. Cannibalism and freezing to death were no longer legitimate fears, but a rush is still a rush, and we had underestimated the deranged logic of lawlessness. Cannabis was what we were after. My brother had been planning this trip for weeks for Wyatt Earp Day, so I could meet his friend Jake Stone, an old-timer, his one-time boss at Stone Containers Box Factory. Jake was rich, was all I knew, because that's all John ever told me, with admiration, without jealousy. He had used his wealth to help John out of a bind years ago. Drunk driving, bail, when my brother was so young that working for Jake had been his first job. Now my brother called himself an old man, but he was still driving the same forklift. Jake, though, he had retired on a mound of cash in Arizona. I had never been to that part of Arizona, but I was eager for Tombstone and Wyatt Earp Day. People dressed up like it was the 1800s. Fake guns, saloons, boot spurs kicking up dirt. Tombstone was one of my favorite movies. Jake, though, was another matter. Something about my brother's excited stories of Jake buying endless rounds of drinks with cash. Big bills in a money clip like a mobster. The fact that my brother somehow knew details of Jake's extravagant trips. To tell someone without shame that you ordered a $4,000 bottle of champagne? That was a mean thing to do, make the rest of us feel like ant smear between godly fingers. On the other hand, I remember when John was in jail years ago, me sitting alone in our apartment, wondering what had happened to my brother. My mother disappeared with some connection in some drug house somewhere. And then late that night, finally someone, the crunchy sound of the key working the lock, the doorknob turning, illuminated by the glow of the TV. I had stared at the doorknob, terrified, because I had assumed that finally I had been left all alone in this world, and whatever was coming through that door was there to finish me. The final boy in the horror movie. But in walked my brother, delivered to me like magic, delivered to me by a rich God. The Sonoran Desert whipped past us. The sun was a flinty warning we were stupidly used to, growing up in the California desert of Moreno Valley. We listened to Tupac and Bowie as the copper ball in the sky peeked between those cotton candy clouds, roasting all living things beyond the safety of our windows. We drove in air-conditioned obliviousness in a moon-age daydream. "You should see Jake's house," my brother said. He wiped his shaved head, which often glistened with sweat no matter the temperature, and then wiped his hands on his big thighs. He sucked a lollipop that was mostly CBD and not THC, he told me. No high, just relaxation. "That's a lollipop," I'd said when he took it out of the wrapper. I don't know what I was expecting, something more illegal looking. I did not partake in anything other than the occasional drink. I believed in control. "Don't call it that," he said. "I'm a grown man. It's a sucker." All of it. Lollipops, chocolate, even cannabis water was legal now. But I still felt like I was on the wrong side of the law just to have it in the car. I felt that way doing ordinary things, shopping while being me, eating while being me, sitting in my own apartment while being me. The law, I understood. Its arm was long and relentless. Control, rules, upright citizenry. I lived like I wanted to be seen, as the cowboy in the movies, dressed in white. Our dad had died when I was a baby, and my mother, grieving, had drunk, shot up, and died eventually, as one does, on drugs. Drugs we had always avoided, but I got stopped and frisked for them anyway. 3 times in my 20-year-old Toyota, insulated with the detritus of fast food wrappers, the blue paint suspiciously dull and rusted. And once in a brand new but rented BMW I'd saved up to ride in style, to my prom. When I'd wanted drugs, legally, Xanax for feeling anxious, my perpetual disposition, my doctor had refused because of the, quote, risk of addiction. "Don't you know," John had said, after telling me to get my shit together the old-fashioned way by channeling some long-ago unknown ancestor and living as they did by leaning into the pain? "You gotta be white to get that kind of help with a prescription." When I asked why he was so determined to get into the weed business, he told me, "To have money, dummy, why does anyone sell drugs?" That's why the trip we were on was big. Bigger than weed-infused lollipops. He was going to ask Jake to loan us money to open up our own dispensary. Jake had saved him once, and maybe he'd save him again, from working until he dropped dead. John had done the research. He could get one going for $200,000 to $300,000 and then sit back and watch the money roll in. White people are the only ones getting rich off weed, he'd said. Jake be getting richer too. No way he's not going to say yes to that. John had been the kind of big brother who pinched my neck and dragged me away from standing around the parking lot of 7-Eleven at night because he didn't want me to get into trouble for something I did or didn't do. It's that old story of big brothers preventing little brothers from fucking up. Maybe that's why he looked up to Jake, because there was no father to grab him by the neck when he was a boy, no one to save him. He'd only had Jake. Also, John's kids had come early and then, all of a sudden, poof, nearly 40 years of life gone before he could suck a lollipop in peace. A lot of people would say he'd had a good life, nothing to complain about. A wife who loved him until he'd blown up his marriage for some girl in the gym with a silicone ass purchased in Baja. Kids who turned out good, teachers, bank tellers, office managers, jobs nobody respected, jobs with no flex, clout, or likes. I owed him big time for my life as an accountant at Duckett Smoller, a small place but a steady job. We had an annual casino night and pool party where all the men wore their t-shirts in the water. Never underestimate the power of someone bigger and older than you telling you to get a grip every day of your life. He'd talked me out of being an English major, for which I was eternally grateful, I'd told myself. "I didn't keep you out of jail and out of the morgue," he'd said, "so you could embarrass me." Still, John always complained about other people doing better and getting more. All the work he'd done, raising John Jr., Jamarcus, Jamari, and Madison, clothing them, feeding them, the rent late, yes, but never once being evicted. The phone and lights turned off only a dozen times while his kids grew up. How disgusting, that level of success. Basic shit, he was always saying. Just basic broke-ass shit. As we drove, I tried to worry less about the details of how we were going to get rich and imagined a different life. I put myself in one of those ugly houses like the ones on reality shows, fake manors that were monochromatic and cavernous, that echoed because there was no art on the walls, no books to be found. I went ahead and gave myself a bowling alley and a theater with red velvet seats, rows of them, plush and wide enough for 2 people to sit in or for 1 person to lie astride in. There was a pool I would never use because I was afraid of water, of drowning. And there were deep walk-in pantries filled with Mountain Dew and dried beans because I didn't know how to cook. Eventually, though, as the sun shifted and the clouds turned from pink to a purplish blue, I reined it in. I thought about what really would be a dream come true, not paying student loans until I die. But my dreams had taken on a fuzzy, ominous gauze, like the moment in Carrie when that curly-haired white girl is putting flowers on Carrie's grave, when all of a sudden a hand pops up through the grave and grabs her. I wish I hadn't seen that movie, or this. Jake had a giant bald eagle as wallpaper on his Facebook page. Memes of things he didn't even realize had been photoshopped, faked. Black people dancing around a burning American flag. The expected comments underneath demanding that Black people go back to Africa, the country, if this country wasn't good enough for us. A photo of Obama's birth certificate, dated and verified to have originated from Kenya. What was I supposed to do with information like that? Jake, who I'd never met, was the man who'd saved my brother. At least that's how I grew up thinking of him, the story I've always believed. But who was this on Facebook? I said this to John, scrolling through Jake's page, when he'd only wanted me to look at Jake's new black Cadillac Escalade, the big, shiny rims. But I couldn't stop reading the comments underneath the dancing black man, stomping on the American flag. I said, really? Look at it, dude. Look at that picture. And he'd said, I don't care what's on Jake's page. Loyalty, fool. You young Negroes are some canceling-ass motherfuckers. The sky was a feeble blue when we arrived at our destination, no clouds to protect us. Jake's house was in a subdivision, in a neighborhood where no one seemed to live. The houses were large and beige, with white rocks instead of grass in the front yard. Everything seemed to have been baked the same color, houses like rows of tanned bread, roofs looking like sturdy bubbled crusts. The roads didn't appear black but sand-colored. The only true color came from the rows of flags accenting each house, bleached pale and hanging limp, begging for wind. We were in a retirement community. No one under 65 was allowed to live there. Jake was safe at 82, but my brother and I were suspect at 45 and 30. Suspect in general, I feared. Standing outside our car in the middle of Jake's unnecessarily long driveway, the sun asphyxiating us and singeing our body hair, John seemed unbothered after 2 lollipops. He was massive, and I was puny because I did nothing but sit behind a desk. My only exercise was a fidget spinner with the company's logo. But because I had succumbed to his mocking, uncharacteristic pressure to join him in his recreation, so I'd be less uptight, he said, I was high off 2 chocolate espresso bean edibles that I'd finally dipped into. I didn't spend time in the gym like John, no body density to prevent me from being a lightweight. I didn't like the feeling of cannabis, my body humming from head to fingertips. And I'd always tried to eat healthy, minus the Mountain Dew. Nothing injurious. No carbs, and mostly greens and protein in the form of tofu. I was a flexitarian, something else that embarrassed John. But we had our father's genes, and I was determined to live like I deserved to live, long enough for a Clint Eastwood Leatherface, protecting my someday lawn with hostile impunity. Besides the buzz, the feeling of my face tingling, and being on the edge of a nap, I had another feeling too, a feeling of dread, the source of which I couldn't identify. The whole neighborhood reminded me of one of those Twilight Zone episodes where there's a lone guy running around desolate from house to house or tripping over rocks on some unknown planet, crying out for humanity. My brother led the way up the winding driveway, and I lagged behind, trying to make myself as small as possible. I don't know why I did that. My nerves? Those espresso beans, maybe? Whatever the reason, I remember this. I actually eased behind my brother to avoid full detection. When Jake answered the door, his stance reminded me of a crab. He was short compared with us, with long arms and big, gnarled fingers like pinchers. He didn't look like a god. He had a big, booming voice, though. "Johnny," he called out. "Old Johnny, good to see you, son." When he hugged my brother, slapping him on the back, he nearly socked me in the face. I was standing so close. "What's that you're driving now?" he asked my brother. "That a Ford Focus?" He stared at John's car, chin tilted up, peering through the bottom of his readers. "Well, hell," he said, "at least it's American." I knew that comment landed like a Tyson punch, but John stood there and took it. He was always longing for a bigger and fancier car. When Jake saw me, he said, "Hey there, young feller." Feller. I stood staring at him, thrown off by his pioneer vocabulary. He looked so much older than he did on Facebook, frail even, with age spots on his head, the wisps of a few strands of white hair floating around the spots. "Get in the house," he'd said, waving us in. "The sun's a bitch. Roast you alive." The house was predictably big, with high ceilings, Indian blankets strewn over overstuffed furniture. Above a rustic mantel, the horse races were on a flat screen too big for the room, the announcer hysterically declaring who was outpacing whom. I took it all in. I was standing underneath a vent, and I felt just as uncomfortable with the Arctic air blasting my face as I'd felt in the inferno of outdoors. I had a thought that there was no in-between, no choosing either fire or ice, that I'd always be in purgatory, and I stopped breathing for what seemed like a very long time. My eyes stayed on the blaring TV and I teetered. The horses, their bodies were glistening, and I was mesmerized by their pulsating, satin flesh as they made their way around the track. I got devastated, not depressed, thinking about how they ran and ran around the track with nothing to show for it. Best case scenario, they were going to make the people who owned them rich. And worst case scenario, they could end up maimed, crippled, with a broken leg and a bullet in the brain. I must have been looking at the races too long, my head tilted and fixated above the mantel, because John said low, "Sit your high ass down. Is it really that interesting?" I sat down on an uncomfortable leather couch, glad to be wearing khakis instead of the shorts I usually wore when I wasn't in the office. I never could stand the feel of my skin against the skin of some animal, long dried up and stretched out. While John and Jake reminisced about old times at the factory, knee slappers about grown men pissing in each other's cups, and bromides commemorating Jake's early work at Stone, getting his character built and whatnot, I looked around the house, trying to make sense of many things. There was a rope hanging on one wall, next to a cowboy hat. There were rows and rows of dolls, some porcelain, some plastic, lined up on the fireplace, inside the fireplace even, as if Jake intended to burn them. I hoped they belonged to his long-dead wife, though that didn't solve the problem of their existence regardless. The dolls stared out into the room, their eyes unfocused and glassy, some wearing little capes, others wearing little white nightgowns as though they were dressed for bed. "Check it out," my brother said, Jake at his side. He pulled on my t-shirt. "Spittoons." He pointed to what I thought was a copper flower pot. They were all over the house. "Spittoons?" I said. "Why do you have spittoons? In your house?" And John looked at me like he'd raised me better and I was being a rude motherfucker. "They're antiques," Jake said, as if that solved the problem of there being disgusting bowls that people spit in. "Yeah," John said, "you act like he's using them right now." Jake hitched up his cargo pants and sniffed. "I do," he said. Why do you think I have them all over the house? I made a face and didn't even try to hide it. Maybe if I hadn't had those espresso beans on the way in, my manners would have been better. It's not that I was so offended by the spitting. It's what people do, spit, outside. But the idea of spending so much money on a house so you can put spittoons all over the place and then spit in them, even people 100 years ago figured out that was repugnant and quit it. I asked, who cleans the spittoons? I really wanted to know. I couldn't see Jake pouring out his own sludge and then polishing the spittoons like new. Not important, John said. His eyes were slits that told me he'd sock me in the face if I didn't straighten up. Before Jake could answer, John waved his hand and said, "Cleaning lady." My thinking was backward, my brother always said. I was too stupid to know, he'd said more than once, that I was in no place to judge. John wanted to pregame Wyatt Earp Day with a beer and a shot of tequila. Jake got 2 Bud Lights, one for me and one for John, and a shot of tequila for John. He stood there watching us both, drinking a glass of milk. "You're not joining us?" I cracked open a beer and drank it down like water. I was all of a sudden a serious drinker. "Nah," Jake said, "I don't drink." "You don't drink?" I stared at Jake, suspicious. He of the full money clip, buyer of endless rounds, didn't drink? He was an old dude. Maybe he couldn't mix alcohol with his meds. High blood pressure or something. Or maybe he was sober. He had worked hard and played hard, as douchebags with shoulder pads in 80s movies announced about themselves. He volunteered the reason. "I just like to watch people enjoy themselves," he said. "You wouldn't believe what all I've seen drunk people do. One time," he lowered his voice and raised a wild white eyebrow, "I saw a man pull down the breeches of another man's wife right in front of him." Jake snickered. John shrugged and poured himself another shot of tequila. Jake had left it sitting on the bar in the kitchen. "Help yourself," Jake said to me, but I shook my head. "I'm good," I said. And John said, "This is top shelf, you dummy." Jake nodded, agreeing with John. I was a dummy for not taking the top shelf. "Really, though," I said, "why would I take something I don't even want?" John pursed his lips and nodded once, as if he was persuaded by the soundness of my position. But then he turned to Jake and shrugged. "You raise him," he said, "the best you can." Hey, Jake said, suddenly pointing to the TV, not caring about my choices. "I just made money off that race." "How much?" John said, pouring a third tequila. "You the IRS or something?" Jake said. His grin was sly. "Don't you worry none about it." "You want to keep drinking or see the shootout at the OK Corral?" I tilted up my beer, trying to get the last drop before we had to leave, and Jake stared at me until I put the empty can down on the counter. "You like my house, feller?" he asked. He had his hands in his pocket and jangled his keys, playing a tune. "Yeah," I said, lying. "That's all?" Jake said. "Just, yeah?" But I didn't know what else to say. It was a house. It was big. Jake looked at the empty beer can on the counter, and then at my empty hands. I could tell he was making a decision about me. We had to go to Tombstone in Jake's huge car. He had trouble getting into it. It was so big, he had to grab the handle overhead on the driver's side and then pull himself up in it with both arms, which managed to be bony and saggy at the same time. He hung there for a minute until he got his footing on the edge of the car and then slid himself in. John and I stood outside watching him do this, John hovering in case Jake cracked his noggin open. But once we were in, Jake looked comfortable and assured. I wasn't. The Escalade was black and long like a hearse, and I had the feeling sitting in the back that I was being driven by the crypt keeper. I read horror comics when I was a kid, and John would always take them from me whenever I got beside myself, looking over my shoulder for mummies at Pizza Hut. He'd say he'd kick the crypt keeper's ass if he ever tried to mess with me. But now, here John was, sitting up front with the guy, laughing and joking, and driving us to Tombstone. By the time we got to the little town, we were between shootouts and had to wait for the next one. The clouds had rolled back in, the bottoms flat, making them look like numinous Buddhas, but the sun still bored into us. "The sun," I said, fanning my face. "It's a rumpant." Sometimes, John liked hearing words he didn't know, but he'd frowned at me. "Cut that shit out," he said. "Not in front of Jake." Then his face softened. He winked at me and nodded toward Jake, walking in front of us with quick steps for an old man. He quoted from Tombstone, loud, so Jake could hear. It did kind of look like the movie. Saloons and shops on both sides of a dirt road. Women walked around in their long dresses and corsets, though some looked more like they were there to spank you or humiliate you for a fee. One woman's breasts were pushed up to the hilt and sprinkled with glitter. She smelled fresh like oranges when she strolled by, and John told me not to look so thirsty. The townspeople weren't doing much, just walking around, but I appreciated the commitment. I loved being in another time when history hadn't yet been decided and solidified, where I could walk down the street carefree, being me. It took a lot for the actors to walk around, tipping their Stetsons to people like us, who were mostly wearing flip-flops and T-shirts and bumping into them because we were texting. Also, there were some tumbleweeds, but they didn't tumble. We walked down the street until Jake stopped in front of what looked like an aged Applebee's with a wooden shingle hanging above it, for Western authenticity. "You guys hungry?" Jake asked. He nodded and winked at a big-breasted woman under a parasol. "I like to come to the same place every year. Good burgers, great burgers." I had a thought. Were burgers invented by then? "Those are the kind of questions he learned to ask in college," John said. Jake shook his head. "Only stupid people go to college." He said this with resentment. "Fred is 10 times smarter than me," John said. "He won a gold medal award of distinction for his accounting." I could tell he was laying the groundwork for his proposition. "But," he added, kissing Jake's ass, "common sense is scarce too." "How much?" Jake said, staring at me sideways. I said, "How much what?" "Money, feller, money." The award I'd gotten was not gold or a medal, but a certificate, my name written in curly calligraphy. "A fair amount," I said, lying, again, and Jake said, "You never ask for what's fair, and you shouldn't get what's fair. That's your mistake, right there." He pushed the door open with his pinchers. Just one door, modern, not proper saloon doors that swung open theatrically. That was disappointing. The restaurant was crowded and smelled moist, and the carpet was sticky and babies were crying their heads off. But Jake was treated like royalty. The hostess knew his name without even asking, and we were escorted to a back room that was quiet. From where I was sitting, I could still see outside, though, and a cloud passed, darkening everything. The faces in the restaurant looked more dramatic, and outside, the dust turned gray. It had been at least 3 hours since I'd taken the edibles, and I was hungry. So when Jake instructed us to order whatever we wanted, drinks and everything, all on him, my wallet told me this was not a flexitarian day. I ordered a burger and fries and mozzarella sticks and apple pie and 3 beers, while John looked at me like a proud papa. He went to town too, ordering several things from the bottom of the menu, where the prices got bigger. When we were done, the table was a mess, napkins all over the place, empty glasses. "Wow," Jake said. "You fellers know how to eat when someone else is paying." John laughed at this, but I didn't. I looked at my watch. I was ready to go see some shooting. It's almost showtime, I said. Jake said, "Hold your horses, feller. I have to pay the bill." "That's not what I was saying," I said. "I wasn't saying, let's go now. I was just saying that it's almost showtime." Jake gave me a hard stare. "Let's just say that I'll tell you when it's time to go." I looked back and forth between John and Jake, trying to get the joke. But John was not looking like there was anything funny going on. He frowned. "Aw, Jake, man, he's just into this shootout. We know Tombstone by heart." "Hey, Mr. Smarty," Jake said. He jetted his heavy glass mug of water at me. "Tell me something you know about Wyatt Earp, you so smart." "I'm not really a Wyatt Earp guy. I'm more of a Doc Holliday guy." "These aren't Doc Holliday days, these are Wyatt Earp days," Jake said. "Could have been," I said. "History is random that way, who gets remembered for the work they did and all that." "What, 'cause he was a dentist?" "Maybe, and he spoke Latin." "No, he didn't," Jake said. "That's just the movie. Hollywood bullshit. That's how smart you are. Earp mined silver, owned saloons, and ran a brothel. That's how you do it. You don't stare down the throats of people pulling rotten teeth, speaking dead languages." All right, John said. "You guys are ruining my buzz." But he gave me a look that said, "Tighten up or I'm gonna kick your ass." "And we shoot sons of bitches before they can shoot us," Jake said, looking at me. He slapped the table and our glasses wobbled. "There," he said, "I'm done with it." The waitress brought the tab and Jake kept her waiting as he took out his wallet. She kept sweeping loose strands of her black hair behind her ears while she waited. He took out a bunch of 20s and put them in her hand, not on the plastic tab holder thing. Then he stood, gripping the edge of the table. He was sitting across from me, so I saw the knuckles in his veiny blue hands turn from red to white. "Keep the change, sweetheart," he said to her. He smiled and his teeth were pearly and white and perfectly straight. False. Then he said to me, "You're welcome." Then, "My boys used to thank me for everything," he said, talking about my brother. By the time we got outside, the shootout at the OK Corral had already started. The cowboys and the Earp brothers and the mayor of Tombstone were already scuffling in the dusty road, but there was a laziness to it. Maybe because it was their fourth show of the day, according to Jake, but some of them looked tired of fighting. The lawmen. The lawmen seemed to be going through the motions, but the cowboys really seemed to be feeling it. "We own this town, Earp," one of them said, waving around his pistol. Then he threw his hat in the air and shot it, for some reason. There was no buoyancy like in the movies. It didn't dart away from the impact of the bullet, but just fell to the ground like a dead bird. Seeing a man shoot a hat with blanks wasn't as invigorating. Earp said, "We're sick and tired of your lawlessness, stealing other people's horses, and being general menaces to society." And then 30 seconds of gunfire. When it was over, Virgil and Morgan Earp were wounded. Doc Holliday, covered in white makeup to highlight his tuberculosis, was grazed and hollering, covered in dust. But at least 3 cowboys were dead, lying in the street, their chests still rising and falling from all that hollering and exertion. Wyatt was fine, standing victorious in the middle of the road. In the crowd gathered, someone's phone rang. Then a man on a bullhorn wrapped it up with some words about how the Old West was a time and a place where justice was swift and terrible, and each man was only as mighty as the steadiness of his hand and sureness of his aim. My brother said, "Those were some bad dudes." "Which ones?" I said, "All of them?" "You know who I'm talking about," he said, "Wyatt and his boys." They did kind of hand the cowboys their asses in 30 seconds, I said. And also, Doc only got grazed even though he was super sick and on his way out. I was rooting for the cowboys myself, Jake said. Wait, I said. I thought you were all about Earp, his whole creative strategies for income thing. And Jake said the cowboys were more creative. John never did ask Jake for the money to help him get the dispensary. They don't talk anymore these days. John seems to go out of his way not to even mention Jake, though I think about him from time to time, against my will. That's because my brother and I almost died that night. I'll be sitting at my desk in my office, doing somebody's taxes, smoking my vape pen with the perfect balance of CBD and THC, just to mellow out and calm the tremors in my hand. And Jake's sinewy, hairless legs will come to me, necessitating another deep toke. That blood seeping through his hair, sparse as cat whiskers. Those guns on the bedroom floor, nestled in brown carpet like discarded toys. How he stood in his front doorway, legs astride, backlit by yellow light from inside, as John and I sputtered away in our falling to pieces American car. We don't have our dispensary. How did we believe that would happen? But now, when I do taxes, for my buddies or for family, I don't even ask for receipts. If they say their deductions are somewhere around $5,000 or $10,000 or $30,000, then, well, sure. The rules don't apply to everybody, so I figure I'll help them gamble. A guy might have multiple LLCs, billing himself from one to the other for, quote, services. So what? That's what they pay me for, to do their taxes. We had to stay overnight at Jake's since we couldn't drive all the way back home to California that night. John had missed opportunities to ask Jake for the money all day long, and when I asked him why he hadn't asked him, he said he sensed that Jake was in a mood. Better to wait until tomorrow. We both stayed in one of Jake's spare rooms with twin beds. He had offered us 2 rooms, but I didn't want to be in a room all by myself. I told him I didn't want him to have to mess up another room when there were 2 perfectly good beds in one room. Yeah, I was 30, but those dolls in the living room, they were never explained. I couldn't fall asleep because it was pitch black in the house and in our room. No city lights to fade the dark. I was wide awake when the door creaked open and a figure stood in the doorway. I didn't believe my eyes at first until I saw the shadow person swaying. It was Jake. My brother sat up straight. "Do you see that?" I said. "Jake?" my brother said. The figure reached for the wall next to him. The light shifted, turning from gray-black to a yellow-brown. There was Jake. He was standing in his underwear, boxers, and he had a holster strapped around his waist, 2 guns at his sides. Slowly, he reached for one. John and I looked at each other and then back at Jake. We both jumped out of our beds. "Are you drunk, Jake?" "You're drunk," John said. "I thought he didn't drink." "You're drunk?" I was standing in my underwear, just like Jake. "That's why you're not smart at all," Jake said. "You believe what people tell you." He pulled a hefty gun out of his holster. I saw a long, ancient-looking barrel and tried to twirl it, but it fell on his foot with a meaty thunk. "God damn it!" He picked it up. He let it dangle in his hand, pointed at the floor. "I don't drink around you," Jake said, pointing his pistol at me. John, I could see he was processing. The gun looked real. We didn't know, though. Was it real? Was he going to shoot us? But why would he shoot us? And why was he drunk? They were antiques, the guns, collectibles, just for show, I prayed. But what if they weren't? There was a drunk man with a weapon in his hand. Jake cocked the gun, keeping it steady, even though he was wobbly. "Come on, Jake," John said. "Give me the gun." "Are you my huckleberry?" Jake said. "What?" John asked, hands in the air. "If I thought you weren't my friend, I just couldn't bear it," Jake said. He scratched his ass with the pistol. "I am your friend, Jake," John said. "You know that. I'm family." Jake was quoting from Tombstone. He was stealing my favorite lines. He wasn't going to have all of them, so I quoted one too, in case that was the secret, the code to crack. I said, "Are we cross? Does this mean we're not friends anymore?" Jake sneered. "I don't know you," he said. "Who's in my house?" And I thought, same. I don't know you, Jake. But that was another lie. I did. It's a hard thing to explain, how you feel if you think you might die, or how you feel if you think you might need to kill somebody so you don't die. But it's that cliche. There was a lot of time in those seconds, lives flashing. When John lunged for Jake, I saw us both in prison. But in the moments before John lunged for Jake, I also saw us dead. Both things were the same. When John tackled Jake, and I heard the crack of Jake's skull against the doorframe, I thought it was over. But Jake was laughing. There was blood on the wall, and John had both guns in his hands. Jake was slapping the brown carpet and laughing. He was going to be fine. "Bang," he said. He laughed and laughed. He blew the tip of his finger and coughed, clearing the phlegm in his throat. "Look at your faces," he said, wiping a tendril of blood that snaked through his snowy eyebrow. "I wish you could see yourselves," he said, with cold, steady eyes, gray like ashes. "You thought the gun was loaded, didn't you?"
Dana, thank you for joining us for the Offing podcast.
I am so excited to be here and talk to you, Ashaki.
We're so grateful to talk more about the story that you shared with us, which was first featured in Ploughshares, called Wyatt Earp Days.
Yes.
And there's some pieces that just resonated with me that I want to talk about. And I want to get into a little bit more about your role as an instructor and a mentor and what you teach people about writing such powerful, concise stories.
Okay. I will do my best.
So I was thinking about the characters who are featured. There's the speaker, there's the speaker's brother, and then there is Jake.
Yes.
Jake is the questionable character. Mm-hmm. And you give us enough information about these characters in the story to get us through the story. Like we have enough information about the speaker based on how people interact with that person. Mm-hmm. So we learn that they're trying to trust their brother on this journey out to meet with Jake. We learn that this person is very cautious, tries not to be a know-it-all, but knows a lot, yes. Has studied Wyatt Earp. This is the icon. Yeah. We learn that the brother is friends with Jake. Mm-hmm. This is the only Black person on Jake's mantle.
Yes.
And Jake's spacious but lonely abode in the mobile park for seniors.
Yeah.
And then we learn about Jake, who is off the chain, cautious, saves his money, but perhaps is losing his grip on reality. I got all of that in the few pages of your story.
Okay.
I'm so intrigued
Thank you.
about how you do this. Like, what is the calculation for how much information you give about each character to move the story forward?
Yeah, like I wanted to write about drugs in America, and I wanted to write about, who was currently making money off of selling legal cannabis in America and who had historically been persecuted for selling marijuana. So I wanted that contrast, but I wanted to sort of talk about it somewhat humorously and also just make it as weird as possible and sort of like disorienting as possible. But so in order to do that, I wanted to kind of have these characters that would be in conflict with each other personality wise. So we've got this older brother who's like, kind of just like big personality. And then we've got the little brother who's sort of like, is full of anxiety and worry. And he still sees his brother as sort of like this father figure. So that's an interesting dynamic between the two of them. And then we've got Jake, who's this older white man who has bailed the older brother out of jail at some point in his life. And they've worked together for years. And so they have this relationship that the brother thinks is pretty cool, the older brother. But the little brother, because he's full of anxiety, he can see little things that like might just be his anxiety or might be like legit things that, people should be concerned about. Classic horror movie stuff where you're like, oh no, what are you doing? Like,
Right. Yeah.
So I kind of wanted to have all of those contrasts and conflict to set up maximum sort of conflict in the story and fear and all of that.
So very well.
Thank you.
As the brothers were approaching Jake's home, I was like, we are not in the city. We are far away from safety. This is what I felt as I was reading. I'm projecting because I was raised in the Central Valley, and there's a difference between kind of being in the city where there are people you're familiar with, families, neighbors, etc., and then you have to go quite a bit farther out where you don't have that anchor or that tether, and you have to trust each other.
Absolutely. And I mean, I have that because I'm a city person. I'm born and raised here in LA. And so I'm so much more comfortable just sort of like walking the streets. And whenever there's like sort of nature, foresty, deserty stuff where there's no people, that's when I'm like, there's going to be a person and they're going to be crazy. Like I just get worried. And so, yeah, I wanted that driving away. And that's sort of a classic horror movie trope where people are like driving, just like Get Out, like they leave the city and they drive to meet the parents. Or even the movie I just watched, X, where there are these adult filmmakers and they're leaving and they're driving to this farmhouse to film this, or Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Like all of these movies have people driving away from like what they know to some weird situation. And so I don't think I was sort of consciously doing that, but that is in me because I love horror movies. So it must have just been a natural choice for me to make.
It felt frightening. It felt frightening early on. And I know we just spoke about this, but the idea of Black people or non-white people going into a territory that is whiter or has fewer connections or less familiarity, where they are kind of foreign to that space. Mm-hmm. And you start to ask the questions, well, why aren't there people of color in this space? Why aren't there people of color who are nearby or being mentioned in the story? You guys are alone. My blood pressure is rising. This is no longer a humorous story. I'm scared.
Yes. And, that setting was, of course, purposeful. This idea of like these two Black men are traveling to this white retirement community to hang out with the brother's, quote, friend, Jake. And there's a line in the story where the brother notes that, like, he feared that they stood out. And it's like, you think? Yeah, like they really stand out in that sort of cultural milieu. And so that is very scary. And of course, we're talking about this at a time when there's been all these shootings of folks who were deemed to be sort of like not in a place that they should be.
Mm-hmm.
So, of course, just historically, that is always there, that fear that violence is going to be visited upon you if you happen to have a brown body because you're in the wrong place at the wrong time. So that again was baked into the story as well, just ratcheting up all the things. Like, we're leaving, Moreno Valley, which is a desert, but it's a desert that's populated for this other kind of desert in this sort of like lonely, quiet, white retirement community. And then, yeah, we have just different spaces and different people in these spaces.
Different people who are unfamiliar again.
Yes. And when you see that American flag in the story, there's like all the houses have American flags. Like, unfortunately, now and more, that is a red flag. If you see it in certain communities, it means strangely that you are not welcome.
Yes, you are patriotic, but you're patriotic for
Absolutely.
the United States that was so young and tender and green.
Exactly. When it was great.
That's it. Please don't bring that version back again.
So yeah, I'm so interested in places and space and where, like, I feel nervous when I'm going places. And so yeah, I wanted all of that to be a part of the story too.
Yes. Place was a very strong character in your work, and it carried my fears for a long time. Even though it was a short story, I was trying to time when they could leave, when they would say goodbye to Jake, just in case this was perhaps a sundown town, like a modern sundown town where
absolutely
you need to leave or you might disappear under questionable circumstances.
Sure. And the minute they decide to spend the night, you're just like, no.
Why are we doing this? I'm looking at the camera saying, we are not doing this. Cut the film.
Exactly.
Right. So I was asking, or I wanted to ask about the element of horror, if that was your initial intent in writing the story, because I was listening to Jordan Peele talk about Nope and the idea of what he called the Jaws rule. I don't think it's a written rule, but the idea is that you trigger some type of anticipation in the audience where their minds kind of run wild. Like, they don't know what's going to happen next. They're living in uncertainty.
Absolutely.
And that's the most uncomfortable place you can exist. Like, you're waiting for the shark to pop up somewhere in unusual and unreal spaces, but the shark comes up at the end. And the way that you've written this, the shark came up at the end.
Exactly.
It's Jake at the door, and you don't know if he's sleepwalking or he's awake and out of his mind. And he's just in a vulnerable state, and so are the brothers, and there are guns involved. And I'm like, this is why we should have cut the film before.
Exactly.
This is my engagement of your work, is just like, how did we get here?
Yeah. And again, like, it's so funny, like, process is such a mysterious thing. So because I love horror, maybe that stuff is just in there, but I have never written that before. I thought I was writing a story that was about like these things, and it is, but how to make it new. And so I just thought the weirder the better, but the weirdness was the horror, I guess, and so I knew, like, it's very important when you walk into Jake's house, you can do two things. It could be like a perfectly ordinary house, and then it's sort of like, okay, you're still there, but it's going to take a while to sort of build that fear or anxiety. So I decided to use the setting to get that going right away. And his house is super weird. There's like, a framed photo of the older brother's family on the mantle. There are stacked dolls in the fireplace because, people decorate in that way. They just put stuff in the fireplace for decor. There's something extra weird about just like dolls in a fireplace, dozens and dozens of dolls. And then there's a rope, hanging on the wall. And of course, Black people in ropes don't, unless they're amazing cowboys, which we are and have been historically. But in Jake's house and Jake's setting, we're not thinking Black cowboys necessarily, right. Not off the bat. We're thinking, why is there a rope in this man's house? Like,
right.
Even if it's just decor, with the dolls, with the framed family photo on the mantle, it's all starting to feel really strange and weird. So I just wanted to make sure I had those kind of details. And then the spittoons, just
the active spittoons.
Yeah, spittoons that are being used just all around the house. That's just weird. Yeah.
It is. I think you did a wonderful job. And this is not for me to judge, but as you walked us into the house and you were like, or the speaker was like, I had to look around for a moment and my brother had to snap me out of it and say, sit your high ass down. Yeah. But I don't think it was about being high. It was about, there are dusty dolls here.
Yes.
Are there women and children here? And also there's the exceptional Black on the mantle. There are no other Black people in this house except my brother, who is friends with this man, has a special place in this man's heart. No other American Negro is in here except my brother.
Yeah.
We're going to have a problem and I'm going to take that beer that Jake has offered me.
Yeah, yes. Exactly. Like my nerves are starting to get a little jangly. It's weird in here.
Yes, your cues are just so perfectly timed. And I have to go back and forth with it. And I'm like, where am I? I need to situate myself. Okay, we are in the house and we're staying in the house for longer than anticipated. And that's where my uncertainty comes in. Like, where is this going? Will we be leaving soon? Will we be able to celebrate Wyatt Earp Days safely? Exactly. Did we ever reach that? So I do want to ask about the close of the way that you chose to close the piece. And it's with Jake on the floor, laughing and concussed, still holding guns, blowing the tip of his finger, saying, you guys thought these had bullets in them. That these guns were
I think
loaded.
he says, you thought the guns were loaded, didn't you? Or something like that.
While laughing.
Yeah.
While laughing. But that wasn't the end of the story. That was just the incident, the kind of the climax at the end that allowed the brothers to depart.
Right. And I'm sorry, I just gave the last line of the story. So that's what he says at the end. But yes, what you're saying is, like we leave him. I shifted time. Like the brother is fine and he's narrating, well, that night, this is what happened. And we never did get the money to open the dispensary because I don't know if we mentioned that, but that was the point of the whole trip.
Yes, to
get
talk
money.
to Jake about his
money. For investing in this dispensary that the older brother wanted to get going. And so there's a moment where you think the story's ended because Jake's like hovering in the doorway and he's drunk and he has claimed previously in the story that he doesn't drink.
Correct.
Right. And so that's weird. And then he's in his boxer shorts and then he's got these antique guns around his waist. And so that's the weird moment that the brother remembers like all of that because he's sort of like safely back in his accounting job, just thinking about all of this. So part of the reason I made that weird move of like moving forward, but then he's looking back at this incident of stuff that, the true reconciliation of it doesn't happen on the page. Like we don't know what happens necessarily. Like, does the brother call Jake and say, yo, what was that all about? Like what happened? No, we don't get any of that. Just sort of like the haunting potential of death and looking back on this man who we thought was friendly to us, came to us in the middle of the night while we were sleeping with guns in a holster. And like, what is all of that? Like, are we safe when we think we're safe? Oftentimes, no. And Jake is a very paternal figure, like they need him for money. And the older brother sort of kissing Jake's ass a little bit. And Jake is very like, if you pass all these tests, if you sort of, show me that you believe what I believe, which is that I am supreme because I am a white man with the money, then I will sort of dole out a couple of bucks for you to start your dispensary. And so it's just a mix of all of that, just kind of like, who can you believe your own mind? When people tell you something, how is it doublespeak? Who are you entrusting your life with? Who seems to be a friend, but has these sort of racist tendencies that can be very, very subtle. Obviously, we know what that is. But the way I wrote Jake, it's not that subtle in the story. Again, the red flags are there just from the minute he speaks. It's just kind of like, this dude is off. He's a little off.
Agreed.
So, but then he did do this one nice thing, which is save the older brother from being imprisoned. He bailed him out over something, and that is a good deed. But right, it does have this vibe of like making a deal with the devil, like, you are forever in my pocket because I did this thing, this quote nice thing for you. But the older brother, who's like, very smart about things, isn't as smart as the anxiety-ridden brother who knows just like, things can be weird, things can pop off. Why don't you see this?
Yeah. I really appreciate the younger brother being kind of the sense of reason, like the embodied angel on your shoulder saying, something's off, let's leave. Yeah. Something's off, let's protect ourselves in that way. So I like that the brother played those two roles. The younger brother played those two roles. You're so good at this.
Thank you.
I know that you've been writing over the course of decades. And I wonder, when you write these stories and when you try to relay how to write stories to students and mentees, what do you tell them to achieve a piece like this, which is brief, concise, high syllables, which takes the reader through an emotional roller coaster, has this cliffhanger resolution, and just sticks with people. There's not a formula for that, but there's craft that you can impart. What do you tell students who are looking to write something like this?
Right. This is always such a hard question. And as you said, I've been writing for years and teaching for years, and you would think I would have a nice answer for this. But the main thing is I always try to get people to do something unexpected, because I teach at the grad and the undergrad level. And this is really advice for the undergrads, mainly because there's a way in which new writers write that can be very formulaic, like in order to get to sort of like the nice ending or the quote surprise death at the end, which is never a surprise. You have to do something weird. You have to zig instead of zag. And I'm always trying to teach them to no, that first thing you wrote, don't do that. Do something much weirder. And again, I try to do that in my own story, build up the violence up to a certain point, but it doesn't exactly go how you think it's going to go, hopefully. So there's that element of surprise. And then there is also the idea of trying to make your characters as complicated as possible. So even though they have a function, like Jake has a particular function, and the older brother does, and the younger brother does, as we talked about earlier. But I want characters to be so specific, and yet reach toward rather a kind of knowledge about sort of human behavior. So we know who Jake is. We have seen Jake since time immemorial. We see Jake currently. But I'm like, but what if he had spittoons? What does that mean? Like someone who's going to spit in his own house. That we got to make that weird. Or what does it mean that he kind of has this faux cowboy speak where he says feller? Like,
yes,
like just weirdly specific details that make sort of the expected new is what I'm always trying to get my sort of like younger writers to think about. And so that's that. And then in terms of tightness, I'm actually not that great at the tightness. Thank you for saying that. But I like jumping, like I like those space breaks where we end with a moment and then here we are after the break and we've already moved on like weeks or months or whatever it is, or into the future or reaching back toward the past. Like I feel like that does a particular work in terms of tightening. It's not meandering at all. It's more like puzzle pieces. Like this first piece clicks in to the end third piece because the middle piece somehow connected them all. If that makes sense.
It does.
Sure if that makes sense.
Absolutely. I'm grateful that you have walked through this writing with us. I'm so glad that you are one of our inaugural podcast guests. I've so enjoyed your writing, and it's a pleasure to be speaking with you as a fan and as an aspiring writer as well.
Thank you, Ashaki. This is the first time we've gotten to like speak at length because we always see each other out in the world, and this was amazing. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Wyatt Earp Days first appeared in Ploughshares issue 148. Listeners can buy the issue at pshares.com. To learn more about Dana and to purchase her books, visit danajohnsonauthor.com. Thank you for listening to the Offing Podcast. Subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, Google Podcasts, or your favorite podcast platform to listen to new episodes as soon as they're available. The Offing is a 501c3 nonprofit organization, and we rely on literature lovers and art enthusiasts like you to keep the lights on. You can support The Offing and this podcast by subscribing to our Patreon. Look for the link in our show notes below or visit patreon.com/theoffing. You can take The Offing wherever you go with one of our fabulous tote bags, bookmarks, pencils, or logo coffee mugs. Shop at wearepastdue.com/store/theoffing. The Offing Podcast is a Past Due production and was recorded at Past Due Studios in Los Angeles, California. This episode was produced by Christopher Chase Godwin. Katrina Mohn is the executive producer. Thanks again for listening to the Offing Podcast.